America has a long history of deliberately blocking people from voting. African Americans could not vote until the middle of the 19th century. We no longer see the kind of deliberate and overt barriers that we saw in the civil rights movement or in the 19th century. What we're seeing now are these more complicated, more nuanced barriers, just reinvented for the 21st century.
First of all, we should have voter ID. When you vote, you should have voter ID.
We're going to have everything. We're going to have sheriffs, and we're going to have law enforcement, and we're going to have, hopefully, U.S. attorneys.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
Even before the COVID pandemic, there were a wide range of tools that were being used to make it more difficult to vote. Over the last 2 decades, voter ID laws have been one of the main ways that it's become harder. States have begun requiring people to show certain forms of ID. And the real fight over voter ID is not requiring people to show ID at the polls. It's what kind of ID are you going to allow to be acceptable? We know that poor people, minorities, are all much less likely to have acceptable forms of identification to vote.
For Native Americans, we're being impacted differently in this election. With our tribal IDs that have to be changed now to have physical addresses. Frankly, in our communities, our addresses are non-existent.
A federal appeals court today struck down several of North Carolina's voting rules.
The court said, quote, the new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision.
The pandemic has only exacerbated that.
Voters in Kentucky demanding to exercise their right to vote. As predicted, there were problems at the polls after the state cut polling places due to the pandemic.
I went over there, the line was extremely busy, long. I didn't feel comfortable being around that many people.
I am now going to have to take time off of work in order to complete this entire voting process.
There are laws on the books in many states that allow an ordinary citizen to walk into a polling place and challenge the eligibility of a voter. For more than 30 years, the Republican National Committee has been blocked from engaging in that kind of behavior, which is called in the US poll watching. And that's because in the 1980s, they did that in a discriminatory way, and they entered into a court order where they agreed not to do that. That order was lifted in 2018, and there's grave concern about how the Republican Party will engage in those kinds of efforts come November.
And the Republican National Committee and President Trump's re-election campaign are recruiting nearly 50,000 volunteers to act as poll watchers in the November election.
We're going to have everything. We're going to have sheriffs, and we're going to have law enforcement, and we're going to have, hopefully, U.S. attorneys, and we're going to have everybody and attorney generals.
And to walk into a polling place and have someone challenge your eligibility simply might cause a lot of people to be scared. You might just not want to risk it, even though you 100% have every right to be there and to vote. We've also seen in recent years states making aggressive efforts to remove people from the voter rolls. States have an interest in making sure that their voter rolls are up to date and reflect the most accurate population. But there are some states that many experts say are just going too far. They're being too aggressive and not taking enough steps to ensure that the people who they are removing are actually people who have moved or are ineligible.
The Brennan Center for Justice has found at least 17 million voters were purged from voter rolls nationwide between 2016 and 2018. Republicans
have really seized on the fear of voter fraud, the possibility that it could happen. Over the last few months, we've really seen the president stoke fears about the security of ballots.
As everyone knows, mail-in ballots are a disaster. There's a lot of fraudulent voting going on in this country. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election.
Fraudulent votes amount to far less than even 0.1% of ballots cast over the last few decades. It's extremely rare. But what the president is doing, I think, is that he's planting the kernels in people's minds that it's unsafe to use this process. The concern is that the president is laying the groundwork to contest the election on the basis that absentee ballots are not going to be legitimate.